Hello, Year 11. I just thought, sorry I'm a little bit late. I've only just got home from school because it's been a busy day, and I've just realised I need to shut the windows because when people are coming over, coming past, it's really loud. Hello, so we're going to start with an Inspector Calls, and then we're going to crack on and do poetry afterwards. Somebody's making jokes about Saucy discovering his treat bag already. Saucy's just eating his tea, actually. Right, so first of all, I think I'm going to do a brief recap of an Inspector Calls, which you will be sitting the exam for tomorrow in the morning. And then after that, I'm also going to do a thing like looking at each character, the kind of things you might include in an essay, and then also looking at themes, the kind of things you might do in an essay. So the first thing that's first is an Inspector Calls. It opens with a family who are clearly a middle-class family of the time, and it's set in 1912. And we see that they're actually quite a well-off family, and it's quite obvious from the way that the room is described, because there is heavy-looking furniture, which implies that it's made of something like I don't know, mahogany or one of those kind of woods that would have had to be imported at the time, and obviously indicates value. In addition, they're drinking port, which again is a drink that we might associate with the more middle class. And we get the descriptions of Sheila, who is obviously the child of the Burlings, and she's described as being rather pleased with life. And so we get this sense that they are a happy middle-class family, and they're celebrating Sheila and Gerald's engagement. Now, Mr. Burling is particularly pleased with this engagement, and the reason he's so pleased is because Gerald is of a higher social standing than he is and his family are. And so because of that, he's really pleased. We don't get a sense at all at any point, really, that he's pleased because Sheila's in love and she's really, really happy. So we get this immediate scene with them. And actually what we learn really early on is that Burling likes the sound of his own voice. He just talks and talks and talks, and he starts to make speeches. We see that Sheila is really immature and young. She refers to her parents as mummy and daddy, which obviously has connotations of childlike behaviour and independence. And then we see a marginally banterful relationship between Sheila and Eric. Mrs. Burling says very little. Gerald seems like a kind of charming young man. We initially get a sense that maybe he's not so charming when Sheila starts to question where he was in the summer and says, "Oh, you ignored me all summer." This begins to foreshadow what later happens, which is that we learn that actually Gerald had an affair. And so we end up with this scene that just seems very, very lovely, and they're celebrating. And Burling starts to make a speech about what a proud father he is, and he says, when you have children, you'll understand. And then actually spends about 3 lines talking about his relationship with his daughter, and then suddenly turns to talk about business. And actually he spends his entire speech really talking about business. So then what we realise really early on is that Burling is supposed to represent capitalism. And Priestley was a middle-class man, and he had a real problem with the capitalist structures. And you've got to realise that actually he was writing at a time in 1945, post-World War II, and as an officer, he had sent working-class people over the top in the trenches, and he had this real sense of guilt about that he'd taken advantage of the lower classes, sending them to their death. And you can argue whether or not that's a right sense of guilt or not, but the point is that he felt guilt about it, and he also was really reflecting on the fact that actually the class system wasn't fair, because people were born into money and then through inheritance, and then continued to stay in that class, and that actually that many of the middle and upper classes were taking advantage of the social class system, where the lower class people, the working class people, were getting paid low wages and really, really struggling. Now, he was writing this in 1945, and that's important because at that time, that's when the NHS was founded. Now, it might be difficult for some of the students watching this to really understand what it felt like, but we didn't have a social state in the way that we do now. So, obviously now, if you get sick, you can just go to a doctor and it's free at the point of use. That was not the case. And so, the problem is that people would go to a doctor and not be able to afford to pay. That changed in 1945, so there was a much more socialist feel in Britain. They introduced council housing, they introduced sick pay, and all of this stuff was the background against which he was writing. Priestley really believed in socialism. And so we get this introduction of Burling as a capitalist. He says a man has to look after himself, and he really believes in the importance of business, which we've seen him talk about. But then what Priestley quite cleverly does is he uses dramatic irony to undermine Burling. So he introduces all these capitalist values, and then he suddenly says, there's the Titanic, it's unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. Well, of course, Priestley knew at the time of writing that it would sink, and he uses that to show Burling as someone who's really self-assured, because he has the repetition of this adverb, of the adjective, unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, and then obviously the adverb, absolutely, to show his assurance. Now, what this does is it undermines our faith in Burling, because Burling just appears to be a bit of a moron and ignorant. And despite how self-assured he is, and that's true of his capitalist values too, we start to question whether or not he's right, because his views about the Titanic and indeed about the war are wrong. Lots of people are asking about poetry and the Power and Conflict. Power and Conflict is going to be at 8, and Inspector Calls is at 7. And in between that, I'm going to try and have some food. So when we learn this about Burling, and Burling's in the middle of making this big speech, all about how a man has to look after himself and his own, and then we get a sharp doorbell, and the adjective sharp's important because it's basically cutting through this capitalist nonsense that's what Priestley felt it was. And the inspector arrives, and the inspector brilliantly comes in and just pulls apart this whole family and makes you realise that actually the appearance of a very happy, very successful middle-class family is actually not exactly what it is. And he comes in, and the first thing he does is he starts to question Burling. Now, Burling responds in quite a defensive way, and he starts saying things like, "Oh, I play golf with the police inspector and the chief of police," and he's trying to intimidate the inspector because he is used to being able to use his class for power. So if you get a question about class, it's important to talk about the fact that Burling deliberately tries to use his power, use his position and his class to intimidate the inspector, because he believes that someone's just put, did you just assume the inspector's gender? They do refer to him as a male, so the inspector originally was a male actor. But anyway, so he begins to question Burling, and Burling uses his own power to try to intimidate the inspector, because he believes that as a member of the middle-class society that he might be above the law, particularly when he's referring to the death of someone like Eva Smith, because in his mind, the death of someone like Eva Smith doesn't really matter. And yes, the inspector's doorbell is described as sharp because it's supposed to undermine these capitalist views. And then we get the inspector, and he begins to question him, and essentially Burling, to begin with, doesn't even recognise the picture. He doesn't recognise Eva Smith. And what you've got to remember is that he sacked her, and he sacked her after she went on strike and led the girls in some strikes. And it would have been really, really significant to her life that she was sacked by Burling. She's never going to forget Burling. She's never going to forget who he is. And yet he absolutely just doesn't care. Just dismisses her. Doesn't even see Eva Smith and recognise her. It means nothing to him, and that's important because again that reflects the fact that the class, to him, the lower class, is all just one, and he doesn't consider them to be individuals whose lives matter. Burling then admits that he sacked her, even though she was a good worker. So Eva Smith was presented as a good worker, which is a positive representation of the working class, but she got the sack because she had more spirit than the others. Eric questions this, and then there's an important line from Sheila, and this is an important one again if you get class, which is Sheila says, "But these girls aren't just cheap labour, they are people." And that's a really important quote if you're going to talk about class at all. It's also brilliant if you're going to talk about Sheila, and indeed if you get a question about the generations, although if you're doing AQA, I think that's unlikely because that's one of the sample papers, so it seems unlikely that they would repeat it. If you don't know quotes, it's not a massive disaster, because you will be able to get marks just from referring to the text. However, you will want to refer to some quotes and do some word level analysis, and the reason why is because you will get marks for AO2, and you can't get AO2 marks unless you do connotations from words. So So once you've done, you've commented on Burling, you might comment on that. What he does is he moves on to Sheila. Now, Sheila's been dismissed earlier. She was told by her dad, "Run along, Sheila," which is horribly patronising. But she comes back in and she starts to talk to the inspector, and what we learn about Sheila is that Sheila got Eva Smith sacked simply because she was jealous of her. And of course there's an irony there, because Sheila should have no reason to be jealous of Eva Smith. Sheila has got her middle class family. She will never have to worry about wealth or education or struggling or anything like that. And yes, she's a woman, so of course she is lower in the hierarchy, so she has less power, and indeed is patronised by Burling is a good example. But what's important is that she shouldn't really be jealous of Eva Smith, but she is, and she's jealous because of her aesthetics. So it's something that's really shallow, and that's something that at the beginning is quite disappointing. It's disappointing about Sheila as a character, because to begin with she does appear very shallow. She's jealous of Eva Smith for being pretty and seeming like she looks better in outfits. And then also when she talks about her engagement ring and she says, "Oh, now I feel really really engaged." And it's like, what? So love and a relationship's not enough for you to feel engaged. The issue particularly is that you need to have a ring on your finger. So that shows that she's a little bit of a materialist. Anyway, we learn that she's made her get sacked, and she's again utilised her class to do that. So she uses her class to attack, essentially, a lower class person, which obviously isn't okay. The good thing about it is that she feels bad. She says, "I'm really sorry, I would never do it again." And the inspector basically says, "Well, it's too late." And Sheila says, "Why did this have to happen?" And we see a real sense of regret in Sheila, because she represents the new generation. She represents moving forward and changing your opinion. The fact that class can change, people's social views can change, because look at the younger generation, they have the capacity to change. And then what's nice about the way the inspector responds is he's really harsh, and he says, "Yeah, well, why did this have to happen? That's what I asked myself earlier when I was looking at her in the morgue, and this girl whose life has been ruined." We then start to hear a little bit about Gerald. Now, Sheila's used as a device here to speed up the story and to create this sense of foreboding, because she keeps saying, he knows. And it's very, very clear that Gerald knows Daisy Renton or Eva Smith when he sees the photograph, but he tries to lie about it. I think that says quite a lot about Gerald's character. Gerald then brilliantly admits to having had an affair with her. Now, he had an affair with her, not through love. He didn't love her, but he enjoyed being with her sexually, and he puts her up in an apartment, and Sheila describes him as being like a fairy prince, and, "Oh, you must have loved it." She's quite critical of him. The difference, I think, is that Burling did something that was deliberately damaging to Eva Smith for his own benefit. I think Sheila did the same thing when she got her sacked. Gerald, however, didn't deliberately damage Eva Smith or indeed Daisy Renton, but nevertheless, he does damage her, and he does it not because he's deliberately damaging her, but because he's selfish. He doesn't seem to care that actually, she's just a woman who's become dependent on him, and he doesn't care really about what it does afterwards. He gives her some money and he clearly feels a little bit guilty, but he doesn't actually care enough to do anything about it, because of course he wants to have his happily ever after with Sheila. And he's also, of course, done something really quite bad to Sheila, which is nice, because at the end she stands up for herself a little bit with that. Sheila is feeling bad still. She's repeatedly questioning herself, am I really responsible? And obviously we're already in Act 2, which is the Gerald section. Then we move on, and what is nice about Gerald is that he does seem, to a degree, to be remorseful, because he asks to leave, and he says, "I'm rather more upset about this than I appear to be." And obviously he goes. He goes out, so we learn that he's guilty. And then after this, we start to see Mrs. Burling's role. Now, Mrs. Burling is meant to represent, absolutely meant to represent, middle-class charity. And what's the problem is that she very happily appears to be a person who gives to charity and does the kind and moral and almost socialist thing. But actually, she's very, very judgmental. When she refers to Eva Smith, she refers to girls of that class. And I think if you're going to talk about gender, if you get a question about gender, it is important to note, one, how patronised Sheila is, that she's told to run along because she's a woman, and the fact that they repeatedly refer to her as a girl. I'm getting a note that's saying it's a very bad connection, but I'm not really sure why that would be. So sorry if this is going weird. If it is, sorry about that. There's not really anything I can do about it.
I've logged off.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Con. So anyway, we've got Gerald. Then we start to see Mrs. Burling. Now, Mrs. Burling really seems to believe that she would have no any reason to have an interaction with this woman. She believes that she is so above, because she's middle class, that she would never have interacted with Eva Smith. And they have a conversation, and essentially she then admits it. And what's interesting is that Sheila, as the younger generation, starts to question Mrs. Burling and says, "There's no point lying. You need to admit it." And Mrs. Burling then starts to admit it. And the problem is, Mrs. Burling didn't like Eva Smith immediately, and the reason she didn't like her is because she used the name Burling. And that's important because, again, it relates to class. The idea that Mrs. Burling thinks her name is so precious and so middle class that how could a lower class girl who'd got herself into trouble, and notice got herself into trouble as if there was no man involved, how could she possibly share a name with her? So there's this sense of absolute pride about her name, and she's above the working class girl. And because she thinks that she's lying, she doesn't allow her to have any money and sends her away. And what's sad about that is that Eva Smith is pregnant. And Eva Smith is pregnant and is asking for help. And there is nowhere for her to go. And there's nowhere for her to go. And what's nice about it is the way Priestley presents the working class, because there was a lot of belief, not so much when it was written, because the class has mixed an awful lot more since then, but certainly at the time it was set, that there was a real disparity between the classes, and they kept very much separate. And there was a belief that working class people were working class because they didn't try, because they weren't honest, because they had addiction and those kind of things. And so there was this real judgment of the working class, and Mrs. Burling absolutely judges her, and she says, she was claiming fine scruples that she wouldn't have had, and she believes that because she is lower class, she couldn't have had a moral code. And what's nice about it is that later on, again, Priestley reveals that actually she was telling the truth, and her boyfriend, I guess if we would call him that, was absolutely trying to steal money, and she didn't think that was okay, and that she didn't want to marry him because she thought that it wasn't okay, because he doesn't love her and he's just a young boy and things. Anyway, so Mrs. Burling won't admit that she's done anything wrong. Very, very much like Burling, she absolutely does not think that she has done anything wrong at all. And she repeatedly says that she's not done anything wrong. She says, there's so many quotes to it. She says, "I meant what I said." And when she's questioned by the inspector, she feels really affronted that he would dare question her because he's lower class than she is. And she says, "I beg your pardon." And she says, yes, it is quite true, when she admits it. But she says, it's interesting actually, she uses the same adverb. She says, naturally, that was one of the things that prejudiced me against her. She uses the word naturally because she'd used the name Burling, as if it would be part of nature to be offended by the fact that a lower class person had used your name because you're middle class. It's the same adverb that Burling uses when he talks about the Russians are being behindhand naturally. There is an absolute assuredness in the way that they speak. They both of them use adverbs to show that they're assured. So absolutely unsinkable, naturally behindhand, and again that she would naturally be prejudiced against her, as if it's part of their nature because they believe that their nature almost is different and better than others. She didn't like her manner, so she was prejudiced. Essentially, Mrs. Burling was prejudiced because she didn't like her because she was lower class. And then there's just this brilliant bit, and this is where you reach the climax of the text, where Sheila clearly realises that Eric is the father, and Mrs. Burling does not realise at all. And she keeps saying things like, "Well, I think that we should find the father," and she says, where's the quote? And if you take some steps to find this young man and make sure that he's compelled to confess in public his responsibility. And what's important there is that she really specifically says it should be in public. And that would be the worst thing for the Burlings. And in fact, we find out later, Burling says, I will give you thousands and thousands so that it won't become a public scandal. And she then goes on to says, I consider it your duty to make him publicly admit it. And Sheila's saying, Mother, and she's really distressed, Mother, don't you see? And suddenly Mrs. Burling says, and what's interesting is she stops and stutters, there's lots of ellipsis, and she says, it's ridiculous. The idea that her middle-class son, who clearly is a drunk, he drinks all the way through, it's ridiculous that he would be with someone that was a lower class. And that it's so brilliantly snobby, and it's such a great depiction of how she thinks about the lower class. Then she starts to realise, and I agree, vote Corbyn, by the way, not that any of you will get to vote, of course. The curtain falls quickly. And with Sheila saying, Mother, I begged you to stop. And this is nice because it totally undermines the Burlings' power for a moment. And then Eric comes in, and Eric very quickly admits to what he's done, which is essentially that he met her in the Palace bar, and he thought that she was attractive, and that he doesn't like all of the women there that he considers to be prostitutes, but he did like the look of Eva, and I think that's partly because she never really was naturally a prostitute. She never really wanted to do that. It just ended up being that she was forced into it. She was forced into it because of the way that Gerald and Burling treated her, and what's sad is that he then goes to the lodgings with her. So obviously he goes to her house because he wouldn't be able to take her home because of the sex before marriage thing, because of the class thing. And it's interesting what he says about it. He says, well, I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty and I threatened to make a row. Now, you might not remember all of that quote, but easily turns nasty and threatened is quite condemning of what he actually did, because if you think about it, he took her home. She didn't want to go home with him. She didn't want him to come in. She didn't want to have sex with him, but he threatened to make a row, and he was at a place where a chap easily turns nasty, so he was clearly drunk. And in terms of talking about that in the text, I would avoid saying Eric raped Eva. I would avoid saying that because I don't think it's quite as clear cut as that. But I do think that you could say that he forced himself on her, and that she felt that she didn't have a choice, and that he used his gender. So if you're going to talk about gender, this is obviously something you want to talk about. You want to talk about threatened. And anyway, so we then learn, and I find it very, very difficult to have any respect or like for Eric's character at that time, to be honest, because he did that. Although, again, he is sorry. But we see his, I guess his immaturity, but his unwillingness really to accept what he's done. Oh, he also admits, of course, that he stole money from Burling. Burling is very shocked about that. What's interesting as well is that Burling seems more shocked and more disgusted by that than anything else. And Mrs. Burling does as well. And so Mrs. Burling has found out that her son had sex with a girl, forced her, had sex with her, got her pregnant, and now that girl is dead. And then the thing that she's most shocked about, and it says in brackets, shocked in the stage directions, Eric, ! You stole money. That is the problem for her, because she doesn't value the lower class, so what he does to the lower class doesn't matter. But what he does to his own family, who are middle class, stealing, does matter. And yes, she did die pregnant, for the people who are talking about that. And Eric then starts to try to blame Mrs. Burling, and this is really the climax of the book, really, when he says, then you killed her. She came to you to protect me, and you turned her away, yes, and you killed her. and the child she'd have had to. My child, your own grandchild, and you killed them both. Damn you, damn you. So there's just this horrific scene where suddenly she's realised, oh, actually, that would have been my grandchild. And then what's interesting about it is that she's suddenly got a connection with the working class, of course, because her grandchild, who she would naturally, one would assume, love, is inside of, or was inside of, a working class woman. Because this baby would be growing inside of the working class. It's nice to see that there's a Man United fan watching this. 2-0, very good. We've got, anyway.
Focus.
And I'm going to focus back on Inspector Calls. And then we have this lovely and really famous Inspector speech where he basically says, look, listen to me. This girl killed herself and died a horrible death, but each of you helped kill her. So it's very important, if you consider the inspector to be a mouthpiece for Priestley, for socialist views, for taking social responsibility, then he very clearly says, you helped kill her. And that's a lesson. And of course, it's a lesson not about Eva Smith, but about the working class. That if you don't look after people and you don't create a social state and you don't create the NHS and council houses and things like that, you will kill these people. You will be taking advantage of them. And then we get this lovely speech at the end with the, remember this, one Eva Smith is gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness all intertwined with our lives. And this absolutely contradicts what Burling said earlier. Burling said a man has to look after himself, and Priestley, through the inspector, says their lives are intertwined with ours. And he says, we are members of one body. We are responsible. We are responsible. He actually says we are responsible for each other, but it's important that his whole message, Priestley's whole message through the inspector, is that one should take social responsibility, and that basically if we won't, we would be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. And some people say that that's him referring to the war, and in, essentially it's about an uprising of the classes. It's about conflict. That there will always be a consequence to your actions. And then obviously we get this kind of really weird ending. I really hope you don't get a question about the ending, because I think it'd be grossly unfair, because I think university lecturers still struggle with the ending and about what it means. But essentially, Gerald, the inspector leaves, they all feel bad about it. Sheila is really distressed, as is Eric, and they have changed without a doubt. Burling and Mrs. Burling feel a little bit, I don't know, I wouldn't say that they were repentant, but they're certainly subdued. And then what we end up with is Gerald coming back in and saying, I've realised that actually maybe this is just a farce and it's a hoax, actually, and we've been had. And they ring the infirmary and realise that actually nobody's killed themselves, and they ring and they find out the inspector isn't real, and they all think they've got away with it. And I think what's an important lesson here is the reason I think the ending exists in this way is because Sheila and Eric have changed. Sheila says, so we're all nice people now, and you're talking as if none of this has happened. And the important quote to remember, if you're going to remember anything, just as a mini quote, would be that Eric and Sheila both use the word frightens, that they are afraid of middle-class values, that middle-class values and capitalist values, really, more capitalist values, they are afraid of them, and they say frightens is the mini quote. And then I feel really, really vindicated at the end, because the Burlings and Gerald don't get away with it, and obviously you get this phone call from an inspector and this sense that it says, yeah, Mr. Burling is here speaking, and we see that an inspector's going to come round because a girl's killed herself. And I think, with the ending, you could argue that it's about the idea of a conscience coming. Obviously, he's called Inspector Ghoul. That's not an accident. Essentially, I think that you could say that it's about that you will always be haunted by what it is that you do. There will always be a consequence. I think that you could say that there's no way of escaping it. I'm not sure. I'm getting, again, that there's a very bad connection, so I'm sorry if you can't actually see this. Okay.
Maybe it's just a bad ending.
Some people may just think that it's a bad ending. You don't have to write about the ending. Obviously, you will get 2 questions if you're doing AQA, and if you get a question like the ending, I would recommend you do the other question. So I've got to plug in my iPhone actually, because it is saying there is 1% battery, and that isn't good. Okay, so briefly on the characters, you may get, you won't get a question about Edna. If you do, there will be complaints all over the place. So you might get one about Sheila. What's important to talk about with Sheila is that she's established very much as the archetypal young woman of the time. She's lacking in power. She's controlled essentially by men. She's immature. She refers to them as mummy and daddy. She doesn't even know when to drink. She's materialistic, and that. As she develops, we learn that she obviously did this horrible thing to Eva because she was jealous, and that's an important one. You might say that she's very pleased with life as well. And but then we see her be repentant. That's important because she's symbolic of change in society, that the younger generation, which would have been the age that Priestley was at the time. So when Priestley wrote it obviously in 45, but in 1912 when it was set, he would have been about Sheila's age. So he's kind of saying, my generation, we have the capacity for change. And obviously they're then the older generation by the time Priestley's writing. He's saying, we're in power now. We really should make a change. So Sheila does feel repentant. She says, if I could take it back, I would. Am I really responsible? So all of that sort of stuff. She also is the person who says, these girls aren't just cheap labour, they're people. So that would be important to talk about with Sheila. And then finally, you might want to just talk about her as, at the end, taking charge. She starts to call her parents mother and father. She says to her Burling, Gerald understands, you apparently do not, so she's quite sarcastic. But she's really direct. She's a changed character, and you could, of course, link that to the suffragette movement of the time, when it was set, not when it was written, but also the fact that women's roles changed as a result of World War II, of course, because women came out and worked. My class, you want to talk about nomenclature at that point, but I'm not going to go into that now, because I think that that's a nice little point I'd like to keep for my kids. Then you might get Burling, of course. Burling is deliberately established as a capitalist guy. He's made, you're made not to like him deliberately, but they undermine his values with the dramatic irony, with the Titanic, unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. We then see him not recognise Eva's picture because the working class don't matter to him. We also see him not care and try to bully the inspector. He doesn't seem to really care the girl's dead. He doesn't really care about it, and he thinks that he's done the right thing because he's a businessman. He's a hard-headed businessman, and that's what's important. And then he tries to defend his family because, of course, he believes that you should look after yourself. I think that the important thing really is that he challenges the inspector later as well when he starts to talk to Mrs. Burling and says, like, how dare you? He then tries to offer him money, thousands and thousands. And I think the key thing really to talk about with Burling towards the end is the way that when he thinks it's a hoax, that he says things like, you'll laugh about it in the morning, that he doesn't seem to care that this woman's dead, or that this woman may be a symbol for the working class, the millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. Doesn't understand that. So you may equally get Mrs. Burling. She is slightly harder to write about. She is described as a cold woman, though, at the start, and that would be important to remember because you can do loads of connotations of the word cold. She's described as cold, and then you carry on through the text, and she is definitely subservient to men. So even though she's Burling's social superior, she's definitely subservient, and she actually says to Sheila, you'll get used to the fact that men have important work. Men who have important work is what she says, as if women don't have important work. And then moving on from that, we then see her role with Eva Smith, the fact that she says that she naturally didn't like her, the fact that she's affronted by the fact that she's used the surname Burling. So we see that she is a real snob, doesn't value the working class, although she pretends to because she works for this charity or volunteers for this charity, and yet she deliberately disadvantages the lower class. At the end, she does actually, to be fair, seem distressed that in fact, they use that in the stage directions. You can quote stage directions. So they describe her as being distressed when she realises that Eric is the father. And And by the end, of course, she thinks she's got away with it as well, and she's so self-assured. I'm really not a fan of her character at all. She says, "Oh, she's so patronising. I just want to push her over." She says about her own children, they're overtired, as if they're not adults. This is the sort of thing you say about very, very small children. They're overtired. In the morning, they'll be as amused as we are. And it just isn't funny. Like, regardless of whether Eva Smith has died or not, it doesn't matter. It's not about that. It's about the fact that you did something wrong and you should take responsibility for it and begin to change your actions. You might also get Eric. Eric, who at the start is described as squiffy, seems quite immature, although does begin to question his father, and it's notable that he questions his father at the beginning, whereas Sheila doesn't, and presumably that's because he's a man. He does say to Burling that he would have paid her more money, and what's nice about that is Burling says, "Well, you haven't got any responsibility. You should take responsibility." And there's an irony there, because actually Eric's being socially responsible, whereas Burling's being personally and what's the word I'm looking for? Fiscally responsible. Fiscally is like to do with money. So we see Eric does have some socialist views already to begin with, but that he is a young man who seems to drink a lot, and he's squiffy. And he then leaves quite early on. He then comes back, and actually really what we see from him, I think the key things are that the way that he forced Eva, so when a chap easily turns nasty, and of course the fact that he then is sorry about it, and he does feel bad, but that he questions his mum. Some people are asking me what questions are going to come up in the exam, and the answer is I don't know, I wish I did. So that's Eric, really. I do think at the end as well you would want to talk about the fact that he says blah, blah, that it frightens him. That's an important thing too. So we've done Mrs. Burling, Mr. Burling, Sheila, Eric, Gerald. I hope you don't get Gerald, really. Gerald, he's all right to talk about. So obviously the ring. The fact that Sheila says, "Oh, who can I drink to?" And he says, "You can drink to me." The idea that he believes that he should be the most important person in her life. And the fact that he is happy to give her instruction, I think is important. I think he's quite sycophantic to Burling at the beginning, agrees with him. He also, I think this is important, he has had a sexual relationship with, for 6 months. For 6 months he's had a sexual relationship with Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton as he knew her. And yet, when Burling talks about the way he treated this lower class girl, he says, "You couldn't have done anything else." So, although he might have seen Daisy Renton as a human being, he doesn't recognise that the working class as a whole are all individuals with their hopes and with their fears, exactly as the inspector says. He doesn't recognise that. Then we move on with Gerald, and he does actually seem upset. So he does seem to be sorry. But then when he comes back again, because he says, "I'm rather more upset by this business than I may appear." Then I may seem more than I appear, I'm not sure. Then at the end, he comes back, and actually we see that he is a clever man, because he's the one that figures out that it might be a hoax. But the problem is that he just feels so assured about himself, and we actually see that again he hasn't really changed very much. He's the one that realises that perhaps someone might not have died. He says, "We have no proof it was the same photograph, and therefore no proof that it was the same girl." So he is smart, but the problem is that he doesn't use that for the good of society. He uses that for the good of himself. And then what I really don't like about Gerald is one of the last things he does. He says, "Everything's all right now, Sheila." And of course, it isn't all right, because society hasn't changed and working class people are still being taken advantage of. And he says, "Everything's all right now, Sheila," and then he holds up the ring. "What about this ring?" And it's such a nice burn when she says, "No, I'm not taking your ring." And obviously, if you're going to talk about her character, you could talk about that at the end. She basically says, "No, it's too soon. I need to think." Or "I must think," is what she says. The other one you might get is the inspector. The inspector's quite easy. You would obviously start, your first paragraph's got to be about the fact that he is representing Priestley's socialist views, without a doubt, and that he's a mouthpiece. He's used as a device by Priestley to show his views. Then you want to talk about the sharp doorbell. Then you probably want to talk about the fact that he's not intimidated by Burling, some of the ways that he speaks to Burling, that he won't let Eric leave, for example, and he tells him not to go to bed. The fact that he maintains control by holding all of the photographs. What other big things with the inspector? The way that he plays Mrs. Burling is just beautiful. But I also think the way that he's quite graphic with them and quite brutal in a way that the middle class wouldn't have been used to be challenged in that way. So he says to Mrs. Burling, "I think you did something terribly wrong and that you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. I wish that you'd been with me tonight in the infirmary. You'd have seen." And then Sheila's like, no, please don't do it. Don't say that again. He's quite graphic when he talks about it burning her insides out. And Mrs. Burling says, "Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility." And the inspector comes back with a beautiful line. He says, "That doesn't make it any less yours." There's also a nice line that he says to Burling when Burling's talking about, he says, "Some people will take the earth," and he says but some people will ask for the earth if you let them. So it's basically about, he doesn't want to increase wages because people will ask for the earth. And the inspector comes back with a cracking line. He says, "It's better to ask for the earth than to take it," implying that, of course, capitalists are taking things from people who rightly deserve them. And then, obviously, you would definitely talk about the final speech, and you would talk about the millions and millions of Eva Smiths. You would talk about their hopes and their fears, etc. Finally, you could potentially talk about his name, Ghoul, and the ending. If you wanted to get into the territory of the ending, you wouldn't lose marks if you didn't talk about that. The final one you might get asked about is, have I done Eric? Yeah, I've done Eric, I think. Eva Smith. If you get Eva Smith, that's quite a hard one. But there are a few things you can say. So Eva Smith, one, she's drinking bleach, or strong disinfectant, it's quote. She's drinking strong disinfectant whilst they're drinking port. That's an important one. You can talk about how she was a hard worker, and actually that she is representative of the positives about the middle class, of the lower class, sorry. We can talk about how she's taken advantage of by middle class people and by men, particularly by men. We can talk about how she's disempowered. You can talk about, then moving on later in the text, about how that she's actually really moral in many respects because she won't accept the stolen money. She doesn't want to marry Eric. And I think really you would need to talk about what Eva Smith is symbolic of. So she is symbolic of women and she's symbolic of the working class. And there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths. And you might again want to talk about the nomenclature there if you're in my class or if you know been taught about that. Okay, so that's the characters done. It's likely you'll get a character question and a theme question, but in one of the sample exams that AQA have given, they've given a theme question followed by another theme question. So that's a bit more challenging, I think, because I think generally theme questions are a little bit harder because you can't just chronologically necessarily go through the text. So I think that the likely themes that might come up would be class and I think gender. I would say social responsibility, but that's in one of the sample texts for AQA, so seems unlikely. So I think class and gender would be the two key themes that I think might come up. So gender, you would want to talk about Eva Smith's lack of voice, the way that she's taken advantage of, the Eric forcing himself upon her, the way that she's repeatedly described as a girl, even though she is a woman, and that's patronising. The way Sheila is treated with the run along Sheila. There's a great sexist quote by Burling that just makes me cringe, and it's when he talks about women and what clothes mean to women. It's just before his big speech. I will find it in a second. They're talking about clothes, and Burling says, "Yes, but you've got to remember, my boy, that clothes mean something quite different to a woman." I'm not convinced that they do, but okay. Not just something to wear, and not only something to make them look prettier, but, well, a sort of sign or token of their self-respect, which is just so brilliantly patronising. And actually, he's seeing women through the male gaze. And what I mean by that's more of a media term really, but through the male gaze, which is that you view women through the eyes of a man. And that's quite common in a patriarchal society, that he thinks that he respects women more when they are attractive, and therefore clothes must be a sign of their self-respect, when actually that's nonsense. But he thinks that because that's how he views women. I think also it's interesting to note that when he describes Eva Smith, he describes her as being pretty. Eric does exactly the same thing. He talks about the fact that she was pretty before he says anything about her being a good sport, and that in itself reflects the society. You would definitely need to put some AO3 comments in there, so you might want to talk about the suffragette movement at the time that it was written, and obviously the war effort and the way that women's roles changed and how they were expected to be changed. So you might want to talk about that stuff. If you've got, so that would be gender. If you got, what did I say was the other one? Class is obvious. So with class, you would definitely talk about them establishing the Burlings as middle class. You would talk about the heavy-looking furniture. You would talk about the porch. You would talk about the cigars. You might even talk about him being a hard-headed businessman. They've had champagne and stuff. So whilst Eva Smith is drinking strong disinfectant, they're drinking port, and so then you move on, and actually our big really introduction to the importance of class, although we briefly get some discussion about how important class is to Burling, because he talks about the knighthood, and I know that your parents, he says this to Gerald, I know your parents might not be happy that you could have married slightly above my family. So we do get this sense that Burling's almost paranoid about his class. And then we get this interruption of the inspector. What's important if you're relating to class is the fact that Burling doesn't even think that she matters as an individual. He can't even remember her photograph, even though obviously he would have played a critical role in her life. The fact that Gerald then says, what does he say? You couldn't have done anything else, because he really believes the fact that the working class are just about working essentially and labour, and he doesn't really recognise the fact that they are individuals despite having had a 6-month relationship with one. Then we get this great bit where we start to see this rising sense of socialism in Sheila when she says they're not just cheap labour, they're people. And actually really what we start to see is, that's all right, Pup. What we start to see is this developing theme that actually capitalism is causing people to take advantage, middle class people to take advantage of working class people, and obviously that's where class is important there. And then probably the most obvious quote to use if you're going to talk about class is Mrs. Burling's "Girls of that class," and it's like the idea that because she is of a particular class, of course she is different. She's naturally different. And she couldn't possibly have scruples, which is the word she uses instead of morals. She couldn't possibly have those scruples. And again, the idea that it would be ridiculous, for her middle-class boy, to have a relationship with someone's quoting Macbeth. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury. Very nice. So that's essentially class. And then obviously you've got the final speech, lovely speech of the inspector, where he says, there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths, and that basically you have to treat them like human beings. You have to understand that these people have dreams. I tell you that a time will soon come when if men will not learn that lesson, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. And what's nice is he says, you can't even say, I'm sorry, Eva Smith. And of course that message to Priestley is, to all of the audience, you can say sorry, you can change it. We have an ability here with the rise of socialism post-World War II to change society, and that's important. You're right, Saucy. So I'm going to go off now. I'm going to come back in about 5 or so minutes, and we're going to talk about poetry, rock and roll, and I'm going to have some food in between. Thank you. See you later.